I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Neda Bolourchi, and I'm the new Executive Director of PAAIA. I want to welcome our congressional and wider audience, as well as esteemed panelists, to this discussion about the internal Iranian situation. It's a 9-month follow-up to the same panel of guests who answered questions in October of 2022. And for those of you who don't know, PAAIA represents the wider Iranian American community, which is estimated to be about 2 million nationwide. PAAIA is a nonpartisan organization that educates on behalf of Iranian Americans on issues of importance to the community. And this includes matters related to education, security, immigration, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and of course, Iran. In doing so, PAAIA makes sure members of Congress know where Iranian Americans stand. And it encourages greater civic engagement within the community through organized census participation and get out the vote campaigns, as well as programs to empower youth to be more engaged in the political process and more involved in improving our communities at the local, state, and federal levels. As you can imagine, what has been happening in Iran, particularly over the past 9 months, have tremendously impacted Iranian Americans. Regardless of political affiliation or generational experiences, Iranian Americans are united behind the brave men and women who have revolted against 43 years of oppression to fight for their rights, freedoms, and dignity. They've done so numerous times over these decades. The last 9 months have been viewed by many as a turning point, and that is what we'll be discussing today. In PAAIA's capacity as a public affairs organization, it has advocated for more than 5 years of practical policy to update and expand sanctions exemptions in support of internet freedom in Iran, leading to the issuance of General License D2 by the Biden administration. This change in policy helps increase access to vital telecommunications tools by allowing technology companies more secure platforms and services be provided to Iranians. PAAIA continues to work with Congress and the administration to further provide and advocate for access by working on legislation like the Concurrent Iran Resolution Act and others currently under review to provide counter-censorship technologies for citizens, expand access to proxy servers, and increase the capability and availability of communications tools and other tools for human rights activists. How to practically curtail the import and use of artificial intelligence biometrics tools remains a vital question. PAAIA advocates congressional legislation like the Mehrzad Act that upholds the bravery and courage of the Iranian protesters, reclaiming their human rights and codifying actions against the Islamic Republic as human rights violators. PAAIA also encourages, of course, Americans to write their members of Congress in support of such legislation. With that, I will pass the next section of today's panel discussion over to PAAIA's Director of Government Affairs, Mehrzad Boroujerdi, who's going to discuss the 2023 survey. And after him, we're going to turn to our 3 esteemed panelists who rejoin us from October today. In the interim, if you have questions for any of our panelists, you can enter them in the Q&A section of your screen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Neda. And I want to thank our panelists for rejoining us. I'm going to try to go through these slides as quickly as possible so we could get to the panel. So let's get started. So I'm going to quickly discuss a little bit about our surveys, an overview of what they are telling us, particularly in the 2023 survey, go over some of the key findings, and then our conclusions about the survey. So the surveys are conducted by telephone, land, and mobile, as well as online. So it's a hybrid model, representing a sample of 401 Iranian American respondents throughout the country, confidence interval of 95%, plus or minus 4.9% margin of error. It does use weighted variables, including age, race, gender, region, party, education, and religion. It was conducted by Zagri Research Services, and it was between January 27th and February 7th of 2023. So, an overview of what we're seeing, particularly in relations to what is happening in Iran, is that Iranian Americans are overwhelmingly supportive of the protest movement in Iran. There's a high level of engagement with the current developments in Iran and interest in US-Iran relations. This level of engagement we've never seen in the Iranian American community before. Overwhelming concern about the safety of family and friends in Iran. Iranian Americans expect civic and advocacy organizations, as well as the US government, to prioritize the advancement of democracy and promotion of human rights in Iran. Iranian Americans maintain close ties to family in Iran. Almost 47% of the survey respondents say they have immediate family members there. Only 6% of Iranian Americans indicate that they have no family in Iran. 4 in 10 communicate with family and friends in Iran several times per week. The most common mode of communication is mobile applications like WhatsApp and Telegram, used by over 3/4 of the respondents. 80% report that the recent barriers created by the Iranian government are having a negative impact on their ability to communicate with loved ones. And this was, again, late January, early February timeframe that the poll was conducted. The most common issue when it comes to US-Iran relations is the promotion of human rights and democracy in Iran at 51%. Followed by promoting regime change at 41%. The promotion of regime change is up 16 points from our 2020 survey. There is a broad bipartisan agreement on these 2 top issues. In fact, their ratings are higher among Democrats than Republicans. So support for returning to the JCPOA has been cut in half since 2020. Only 15% of Iranian Americans support the United States returning to the deal. Now, this has been probably the most significant changes in our data that we've seen since 2016. In 2016, the JCPOA had an approval rating of 65%. Based on these findings, we are not advising the US government to negotiate a deal with Iran. In this question, we asked respondents if they want the US government to support the protest movements in Iran. And what stands out is only 6% of Iranian Americans do not want the US government to support the protest movement in Iran. Expanding legal funding and remove of legal barriers to support internet freedom in Iran is the highest at 38%. Banning Iran's leadership and their families from getting visas is at 34%, and imposing and tightening human rights sanctions against human rights violators in Iran is at 29%. We also did some questioning on people's views of Iranian political leaders, both those inside the country and outside the country. And we asked what their favorable or unfavorable view of those leaders are. Human rights attorney Nasrin Sotoudeh has the highest net favorability rating. And when I say net favorability rating, we're taking their favorable and unfavorables and adding those up. So Nasrin Sotoudeh has the highest at plus 26%. Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi has the second highest, along with soccer coach and former player Ali Karimi at plus 20%. The Iranian leader that has the most negative favorable rating is the president of Iran at negative 55%. The second least favorable is Maryam Rajafi at negative 46% favorability rating. So in conclusion, an overwhelming majority of Iranian Americans support the protest movement in Iran, and I believe it will have a positive impact in the country's future. The top choices for how the US can support the protesters are expanding Iran's access to the internet and to ban their leadership and their families from obtaining visas. On a bipartisan basis, the Iranian American community wants the US government to prioritize advancing democracy and human rights in Iran. And Iranian Americans continue to believe that grassroots democratic movement is the best way for Iran to move towards a more democratic society. Iranian Americans want to hold the Iranian regime accountable for its human rights violations and do not want to return to the JCPOA. So that's our poll results. During the question and answer session, if there's any questions, we'll be happy to come back to the poll results. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mehrzad. I'm going to now introduce our three panelists who've returned from October to talk about what's been happening in the changes or static movements over the course of these past 9 months. Our first panelist is Dr. Mehrzad Boroujerdi. He has so many accolades and credits to his very long and distinguished CV, so I'm going to be brief with them and say that he is currently the Vice Provost and Dean of College of Arts and Sciences and Education at Missouri University. He was previously Professor of Government and International Affairs and the Director of the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech. And before that, I think most of us know him as Professor of Political Science at Syracuse University, and his well-regarded and renowned book, Iranian Intellectuals and the West, The Tormented Triumph of Nativism. He is also the co-author of Post-Revolutionary Iran, a Political Handbook, and the editor of Mirror for the Muslim Prince, Islam and Theory of Statecraft. Of course, Dr. Boroujerdi has many other publications, including dozens of articles and appearances on national and international news and radio. He has been the president of the Association for Iranian Studies, a fellow of the American Council on Education, and a co-investigator of the Iran Data Portal, which has been very informative for many of us. Next to him is Dr. Hadi Ghaemi. He is an international recognized expert on Iran and human rights. In conjunction with other human rights activists in the Netherlands, he is the co-founder of the Center for Iran Human Rights, formerly the International Campaign for Human Rights in Iran. CHRI is a leading organization documenting human rights violations and building international coalitions to support human rights. Previously, he was with Human Rights Watch as the Iran and United Arab Emirates researcher. His work at Human Rights Watch focused on international attention of the plight of migrant workers in Dubai, as well as the repression of civil society in Iran. After the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, he was a member of the first UN-commissioned human rights fact-finding mission there. And if that was all not enough, Dr. Ghaemi previously taught physics at City University of New York, and he has published his groundbreaking research on nanophysics and holds 4 patents in that field. Next to him is Holly Dagres. She's a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs. She's also the editor of the Iran Source, as well as the MENA Source blog, and curator for its weekly newsletter, The Iranist. Before joining the Atlantic Council, she worked as a freelance Iran analyst, regularly following and appearing on traditional and social media in English and Persian. She's worked as the assistant editor at the Cairo Review of Global Affairs. Currently, she gives regularly analysis for television, radio, and print, also a very long list. Most recently, however, if you have not seen it in the New York Times, she was published on her article on the endangered rapper Kamaj Salehi was published the last couple of days. So if you have not seen it, you may want to check that out. Born in Los Angeles, Holly has spent her adolescent years from 1999 to 2006 in Iran, and she graduated from the Tehran International School. So she is, of course, fluent in Persian. So that is the introduction to our panelists today, and we will then, if you don't mind, dive right in and back into the questions about what has been happening in Iran these last 9 months. And in the last panel, each of you mentioned how the Massa revolt is different from those that came before, different than 1999, 2009, 2017, and onward. Hadi specifically mentioned how what we have been seeing is an irreversible process between state and society, and there's no going back. Holly mentioned that her contacts insisted that this time is different, and Mehrzad also analogized the revolts to a heart attack, one that may not be fatal, but which will nevertheless make an impact for years to come. Now that we're 9 months later, the question to each of the panelists is, how do you assess what has transpired over these last 9 months? And do you find that your initial assessment holds? Why or why not? And why don't we maybe start with Dr. Boroujerdi, if you would like to lead us off on that question?
Sure, we'll be happy to. Thanks for having me. Yes, I believe my assessment of the uprising as a non-fatal heart attack, proved to be correct. I believe that the message was delivered loud and clear about the level of discontent in the country. There is no question really about it. Many of Iranian citizens, I believe, pushed the envelope when it came to fear, or the envelope of fear in this regard. And this is not something that can be easily reversed. We are already seeing sort of the breaking of many taboos in regard to the dress code for the ladies, greater respect for issues related to personal space, individuality, pluralism, and the like. I think the active presence of women and the youth in this movement has really generated a greater level of respect in understanding what it is that they are complaining about, what it is that they are, demanding about in regard to social and political rights. After all, when it comes to women, they are struggling or wrestling with the most anti-woman regime, perhaps in Iran's history, in that sense. So I think these are some of the things that we saw. I think one of the other positive elements of this movement was that many prominent individuals basically broke their code of silence and came out and publicly denounced the government for its reprehensible human rights record. I believe the impressive participation of the Iranian expatriate community that, as was mentioned before, we had not seen anything like this, was quite impressive for many of us. And finally, I would say that I think, with this movement, we should keep in mind that this was much more radical in its demands than anything we have seen in the past, right? It was not objecting to this particular event, this particular policy. It was targeting the entire state, the entire system. The supreme leader, became the target for many of the slogans, denouncing what's happening in Iran. So yes, it was not a fatal, heart attack, but like any serious heart attack, the patient has to live with its repercussions, and I think that's what we're going to see.
Thank you. Hadi, your thoughts? You're muted. Hadi, you're muted.
My apologies. I was saying that Mehrzad summarized very well, but let me just add that, yes, I fully hold on to my understanding back in October that these events are indeed unique and irreversible, and do not see it actually just because people are not on the street, just because it's not on the front page of newspapers internationally. It absolutely does not mean that this movement has finished and should be kind of cataloged along with the previous protest movement. It is continuing. It's absolutely continuing. And I want to point out the situation of lack of legitimacy of the government has not been repaired whatsoever. If anything, talking to more and more people of all walks of life, we hear that they have no faith in this government. So, and regardless of people's presence or attitudes toward government, there is two dynamics happening that, regardless to me, indicates collapse of the Islamic Republic is well underway. One is the fact that they absolutely have not been able to address any grievances of the protesters or put forward any programs moving forward. If you look at Rais's government over the last 9 months, it's not clear that besides repression and holding on to power, what is their priority? You really don't see any policies. And the second indicator, and therefore that also shows a lot of internal jockeying ahead of the supreme leader's passing, which is well expected in the coming years. And the second indicator is just the overwhelming crisis on every dimension facing the Islamic Republic, and again, the lack of any answers to them. Whether it's the crisis of the youth and women who absolutely do not speak the language of this government, have no affinity for it. The economic crisis is really serious. Poverty is gripping every family, and that is eventually going to lead to a lot of uprisings, I believe, out of desperation. And of course, environment is extremely important. We rarely hear from it, but given we're on the verge of the hot season coming up, and we've seen in previous years that has led to protests and environmental catastrophes, I think all those crises are not being addressed whatsoever. So to me, the Islamic Republic is really an ice mountain that's melting in front of our eyes. And people are trying to find a solution to what happens afterwards and push it forward. And the biggest challenge they have is representation and association and organization, which this government is so good to prevent. And that may fall on the diaspora to become a voice for them. And that is a lot of I just want to emphasize that behind the scenes, there's a lot of internal brainstorming inside the country for a roadmap, for a Bill of Rights, for a vision of the future, for a horizon that people can get excited and agree and come together. And of course, abroad, we also know there are many initiatives. But I am very much looking inside Iran for these challenges to be addressed in form of organization and putting together something that people can rally around. That is probably the biggest challenge of the protests right now.
I think you're right. Thank you so much for that. And Holly, please.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I have to say those are two big hard acts to follow. So I'm going to make my remarks as brief as possible. I would continue to say that this time is different. And I say this because contrary to the lack of media coverage we've been seeing, we're still seeing protests against the Islamic Republic day in and day out since Mehrzad Amini was murdered in September 2022. And to me, that's unprecedented. Yes, we've had protests continuously since December 2017, but for it to be every single day is what's really new. And yes, they have evolved to graffiti, chanting from windows and rooftops, and public displays of not abiding by mandatory hijab. However, we are also still seeing street gatherings in public settings, particularly in places like northwestern Kurdistan and southeastern Sistan and Baluchistan provinces. As some of our viewers will know, both have been big targets of government repression and discrimination due to being a Sunni majority in regions with ethnic minorities, of course, the Kurds and the Baluchis. But I think a lot of the skepticism these days is that the numbers aren't big, so these aren't really protests. Well, what is a protest to you? Is it that thousands gather in the streets, or is it these acts of defiance every day? And to me, I think it's these acts of defiance. And yes, these numbers aren't very big, but the reality is that the clerical establishment is in a tinderbox situation. And as my co-panelists have highlighted, the situation is ripe for discontent. And it's only a matter of time before protesters pour out in the streets again en masse, because the people of Iran have had enough. They don't want this government, they want this regime gone, and they want change. So I think we're just sitting in a situation where things are going to really pop off very soon again.
Great. Thank you also very much for that clarifying point about quantity of protesters versus the frequency in which there are actual protests. And I think the point that you're making with that about defiance is a fantastic point, not only for our regular sort of followers of Iran, but also those who are joining us today. And kind of a little bit of combination between what you've just said and a reflection back on Hadi's statement. I'd put the next question to him, in particular because of the crisis that he and you both have addressed a little generally, so I'll be more specific with this question for him. Around May 19th, the Islamic Republic executed 3 men, Said Yaghoubi, Saleh Mir Hashimi, and Majid Kazemi, for their alleged roles in the shooting deaths of 2 Revolutionary Guard members and a police officer in November. The reports about what's being called the Isfahan House case assert that these 3 men were forcibly disappeared, tortured, and forced to make self-incriminating statements that were subsequently used against them. 1, do you find this sort of general statement about what happened true? And then 2, how does the Isfahan House case relate to or differ from other cases and executions that you and the Center for Human Rights are following? And is there a trend? Sorry, I'm going to ask you a series of questions, but I'll stop here with the third one. Is there a trend with the empirical data that you see regarding arrests and executions? And sort of comment about any legitimate reasons or any legitimate cases that you're seeing. And then finally, as part of my broader question to you, Hadi, is this what you, when you talked in October about furupushi, is this an example of legal furupushi? Is the Isfahan House case one of those, and the collapse of the legal system?
Yes, thank you, Neda Jan. Before I answer your multitude of questions, I think we should have the big picture. Many people, especially non-Iran experts, may wonder that Iranian judiciary actually represents an institution that must somehow be related to the concept of justice. And I'm afraid to say that absolutely not. Before we talk about how they are treating protesters, let's point out that the judiciary has not taken a single step to address 550 people killed on the streets, including 71 children, including the 10-year-old Kian Pir Falak, who is so famous now with the circumstances. Absolutely no interest to investigate or claim. When they say we didn't do it, then who did it? Are you investigating? None whatsoever. And yet at the same time, we see a number of protesters who have been taken to capital punishment charges and now have been executed. I believe 7 of them, including the latest 3. I do not call them executions or following a judicial process, but I use the term Iranian lawyers in the country are using, which are that these are state killings, a state murder, and is really a form of revenge on protesters. Because when you look at the actual prosecution procedure, you don't even see any of the Iran's own laws being respected. For example, in the case of these 3 men, they charged them with moharebe, which means the state has brought these cases against them and requesting capital punishment, but the end of their indictment refers to obtaining or working with the families of the victims regarding blood money or forgiveness in a very vague way, which means that is qisas, which is completely a different form of legal process in cases of murder, and it requires an individual family or person bringing charges, not the state. And you can see that they're not even in the top of their own laws and procedures. With regard to the 3 men and the previous 4, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that they engaged in these acts of murder or violence they're accused of. However, we do know 30 to 40 government agents got killed and many more harmed. Probably when they were attacking people. People have a right to defend themselves. I cannot talk about the ones who died. I believe it's, they don't know how it happened, but they are eager to put somebody to death for it. And this is not the first time I'm seeing it. For 20 years, I followed executions in Iran, whenever they cannot find an actual person who can be proved to be involved in this crime or violence, they have to find someone. And what we're finding are these young men whose only evidence is that they were in the protest on that day, and they were notable. They were brave and notable. Therefore, they can identify them. The only evidence we see in every case is self-incriminating confessions, and multiple times we've seen these men have been able to send messages from prison that I was tortured. I was brought to a point, or my family was threatened, that I had to confess to this false allegation. Again, Iranian law should dismiss those allegations, but that's all we're seeing. So I see this really revenge killings to put the population in its own place, to give assurances to security forces that we have your back, and they really don't care who they are hanging. And that is the saddest part of it to me, that they're just eager to put together a show and say that for each of our agents who died, we have killed 2-3 of the protesters. And that is truly the judicial legal collapse you're mentioning, Furupashi, when their very own basic laws and procedures have no weight whatsoever in their courtrooms.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that fuller analysis. And along those lines, before we get to a question I have for Holly and related to the one for Mehrzad, in the last panel, you discussed the 3 important factors contributing to these revolts. One was the impressive levels of unity inside and outside Iran, and how important this is given that 50% of the Iranian population is 30 years or younger. 2, you also said the demonstration of political maturity and its inclusiveness is especially profound since there is not a leader in charge. And 3, you said the presence and commitment of women and the changing gender norms are pivotal. In these 9 months, do you think these 3 factors still hold? Are they as solid as they were in October? And if not, what has changed? And along these lines of what has changed, if I can sort of ask you a leading question here, if you would discuss the importance of what is known as the gray mass in relation to the pockets of revolts that Hadi and Holly are telling us about.
Right. So I guess as I answered in the first question, I think there is no question in my mind where I stand in terms of this movement and the crisis of legitimacy that the state is suffering from. But I also want to add this. I think we really need to have an honest conversation regarding what are some of the shortcomings and difficulties that we observe on the part of the opposition as well, in order to really have a proper assessment of what has happened. So the answer to your question here is, unfortunately, the unity and maturity that I was calling for did not materialize. It did not last long. Unfortunately, the opposition could not maintain its sort of durability that we saw in the earlier stages and succumbed to internal differences over a whole host of issues. For example, who should be the leader? Was it proper to seek the support of Western governments? Should we be asking or encouraging Western democratic states to impose more sanctions or be calling for lifting of sanctions? How do we assess the issue of federalism, ethnic rights in the country, and issues of that sort? Should we be destabilizing the banking system by withdrawing money, as was suggested by some, et cetera, et cetera? Should there be amnesty or punishment for regime loyalists if the regime was to fall, et cetera, et cetera? So in other words, I think as this movement tries to mature up, right, these type of questions, this type of difficult conversations was inevitable. And I think, we are still going through that learning curve in trying to settle these set of issues. My assessment is that the movement that really started with so much energy in the earliest stages, sort of dissipated due to a number of factors. One, of course, is the state's repression, right? This is a state that doesn't care much about its, prestige. international, human rights records and things of that sort. Its favorite tactic is to use, brute force. That's clear. But I think, part of my answer, sort of in terms of what is an honest assessment of the situation, really comes to the pointed question you were asking about the gray zone masses, Neda, right? I think it's fair to say that what happened here was the inability of the opposition movement to galvanize this so-called gray masses. And what do we mean by that? We are referring to those disenfranchised Iranians who did not like the regime and yet were too risk averse, right, to come to the protest. Let's be frank, no social class really joined into the protests. The urban poor, the workers, the peasants, were not there in mass, right, corresponding to their numerical size in Iran. And I think, it really, the responsibility falls on the shoulders of people like us as analysts of Iran to really, investigate and decipher what were the type of reasons that prevented from these gray masses to join the protest. So in my argument, in a country of 87 million, it's not enough to have even 500,000 people come out in the streets to, if you're interested in bringing about, regime change. So whether it was their fears about civil war, anarchy, or regime, repression, I think, for whatever reason, these masses did not participate. And one can say that maybe this was the Achilles heel for the movement. So I agree with what Holly was saying. I think the Iranian state is a crisis-prone state. This was not the end, the last protest. There is bound to be more crises coming up because we know the regime is fundamentally incapable of addressing the fundamental challenges that it faces, whether it's, issues about the youth, women's demands, whether it's, addressing the infrastructural problems of the country, water resources, dealing with the aftermath of an earthquake, God forbid if that were to happen, et cetera, et cetera. This is not a regime that is, able to solve those fundamental problems. So another one, will be down the road. That's why I refer to what has happened over the last 9 months as really a dress rehearsal for a revolution yet to come. And I think, again, it's our responsibility to clearly, with clear eye and conscious, assess both the accomplishments as well as the weaknesses of what we saw if we really wanted to learn lessons from this dress rehearsal.
Thank you very much for that. And since we've alluded to it, we're going to get right into it with Holly. So you focus and specialize on Gen Z and the social media in Iran in particular, Holly. And so if you would let us know and talk about what you're seeing over the course of these last months with Gen Z, particularly the younger women, and in fact, high school girls, and maybe include what it is they want in sort of your response.
Sure. Well, I'm going to start by saying that as we speak, Iranian schoolgirls, more than 13,000, continue to be poisoned at schools across the country. So this isn't an international media story anymore, but it's actually still happening. And many believe this is a punishment for their participation in the anti-establishment's protests. Now there's actually more evidence of that being the case. 1500 tasvir, 1,500 images. A well-respected popular activist collective tweeted last week that the preliminary results of tests done on the clothing of poisoned schoolgirls suggest that there was use of nerve agents. And UN experts actually pointed out in March that these poisonings are deliberate. With that in mind, countless young Iranian women actually continue to defy the clerical establishment's state-enforced mandatory hijab laws. And we've been seeing them upload countless photos and videos of themselves doing so. And I have to add that Campaign for Human Rights in Iran, Hadi's organization, does a great job of amplifying some of those posts. And so this is happening despite the fact that there are now even more strict laws in place, including security cameras that have surveillance technology, I believe from China, that are actually able to identify the women. There's threats of hefty fines of them being not allowed to work, and businesses are getting threatened and actually have been shut down because they allow women that aren't wearing mandatory hijab to enter the premises. We've been seeing on social media that some women are going as far as trolling government propaganda posters about the virtues of hijab by appearing without hijab in front of them or flipping the bird. And this is actually even in the case with senior leaders of the Islamic Republic. They've done this in front of pictures of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And just the other day was the death anniversary of the founder of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And we saw similar pictures of acts of defiance on June 3rd. In recent months, one incident that stands out that went viral was the Ekbatan girls. So for those not familiar, Ekbatan is the name of a housing complex in Tehran. It's actually been the site of ongoing anti-government protests, and residents there have been targeted with apartment raids, tear gas. We've seen incidents of security forces shooting pellets at windows, and there's been countless of arrests there. So long story short, a group of Gen Zers got together and did a dance to Reem and Selena Gomez's hit Calm Down to mark International Women's Day on March 8th, and they appeared without hijab. The video not only went viral within Iran, but across the world. And unfortunately, the girls were identified and arrested and forced to pose an apology video by the security apparatus. But rather than that be taken as a message to silence dissent and what would happen to you if you acted out, countless Iranian women and girls across the country actually did their own versions of that video and posted it online to show solidarity and to defy the Islamic Republic. I think the one thing, the key takeaway here is that since the protests have erupted last fall, they continue to simmer, and with the repression on the rise, I think that Iran's Gen Z have made it abundantly clear that their demands for change cannot be silenced. And not to plug in my New York Times piece, but I'm going to read a quote from it because I think it really explains this message well. And it's that all the clerical establishment's efforts at breaking the people of Iran for the past 4 decades have merely been an iron forge and a fire calling for change. So what we're seeing here with this new generation of Iran's youth is a defiant spirit in that it cannot be broken. And I wouldn't underestimate this generation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. I think that's a great place for us to pause and turn to a number of excellent questions that have been asked. I think we'll go with maybe the first one. It's a technology question on how the US Congress can fund or subsidize Starlink internet, as was done for Ukraine. Why can't this be done basically for Iranians who want to use it? Because quite frankly, the gist of the person is saying is that it's expensive and the monthly cost for the subscription is also high. So can Congress fund or subsidize Starlink? And how would that be sort of viable? And I'm wondering if maybe Hadi has some thoughts on that, but open to our panel generally.
I'll be very quick. That would make a huge difference. And it's not just a Starlink. I'm hoping new technologies in regular mobile phones, especially iPhone, new iPhone 12, 13 actually, will accelerate consumer access to internet satellite. But for now, the Starlinks is definitely something that we need to promote and expand inside Iran, especially in anticipation of internet shutdowns. I don't think the US government can that directly get involved with the private sector in the mechanics of it, but it can very easily subsidize the companies that would help Iranians to get access. That means Starlink could get encouragement, economic business encouragement through subsidies where it would open offices in neighboring countries like Turkey, Dubai, Georgia, Armenia. That way Iranians can go there, obtain these dishes, bring them back to Iran on their own. I understand those things can really happen. And if the company has enough support through subsidies, it can reduce the rate of $100 a month, I believe, for Iranians, or even waive it. So I think it's not unprecedented that the government help a private sector initiative that can be impactful to move forward. So I highly recommend the US Congress consider that. And the State Department already is spending, I believe, $80 to $90 million a year in support of Iranian civil society. It can ask for more or try to immediately channel some of it to these activities. But I hope we stop talking about it, because the general license D2 you mentioned, that you worked so hard and we were a partner with you in making it happen in DC, could have happened on January 2021 when Biden took power. I was personally encouraging them to do that, but unfortunately they waited till this movement came about, and it has been a great, action for them. They can say they've done that, but they could have done that 2 years ago. So now also we should, I hope Washington will stop asking what to do, and as it gets such suggestions, act on it, because time is of essence.
Maybe we'll go to the second question, which I think is a little bit inclined towards an opinion piece, but explicitly the person has written, what is the current administration's position on releasing $7 billion to the Islamic Republic? For those who don't know, the Iranian American community and Iranians generally were very upset with the Obama administration for giving the Islamic Republic cash as part of the JCPOA. So I think this question generally is related to that, but also in the idea of like negotiations. So I'm not sure if any of our panelists have any thoughts on the $7 billion or if that is even being discussed, or if anyone wants to address this money sort of held by the US government, frozen by the US government.
I'll take one for the team. So the $7 billion that's being referenced is the ones that are frozen in South Korean banks that belong to Iran. And so from what I've been hearing, and again, when we talk about money given to Iran, it's always Iran's frozen assets. It's not just at random. And when I'm going to say this with clarification, when I'm saying this, it's not because I advocate for this. This is merely what I've heard is happening. So I'm not in favor of what they're doing. But from my understanding is that potentially there's talk that Iran would get the $7 billion in frozen assets as part of an interim nuclear deal. Now, they're not, from what I've also been told, it's not that they're going to be giving it directly. It would be through a humanitarian trade channel. So whatever, let's say they need medicine from Europe would provide the medicine, and that money from the South Korean banks would supposedly go to Europe. It would never go to Iran. And that's the rumor that I've been hearing, but that was months ago. And I'm not entirely sure what's happening there, but I did read that there has been talks, maybe some of you have read this as well. The Financial Times put out a piece just the other day saying that the Europeans and Americans are talking about what to do about Iran's nuclear program. But that's the latest I know. And the conversation about the frozen assets was months prior. And again, not my opinion, just what I've heard.
So related to that, there is a question here that says, how do we trust the Biden administration is supporting the 80% plus Iranian people fighting for their freedom when we hear new discussions about negotiations with it's not usually the IRGC, but the Islamic Republic, particularly over frozen assets in Iraq and South Korea, sanctions being actually enforced rather than just being on paper, and failing to block the UN's decision for the Islamic Republic to chair numerous committees. It feels like what the administration says and does are very different things, and it's disappointing.
So maybe I can address that one. Look, my expertise is in international relations, and I come from the realist school of thought, where I think it is fair to say that governments generally, everywhere, pursue their national interests. So I think when it comes to the United States, even though as the poll that Mehrzad showed, indicates that the vast majority of Iranian Americans, and I would venture to say Iranians inside the country, also want the United States to really concentrate on the, addressing the human rights problem in the country. The fact is that, Washington doesn't necessarily think in regard to just the human rights issue, right? And for them, the nuclear issue is perhaps the biggest topic of concern when it comes to Iran. So the discussions we are hearing right now, whether it was what Holly addressed regarding the unfreezing of this $7 billion, the discussions we are hearing about working out a plan to release perhaps some of the dual Iranian American citizens that are, held in captivity in Iran, etc. I think those are being viewed as sort of a down payment on a potential nuclear deal. The fact of the matter is that Washington is concerned about the volume of enriched uranium that keeps going up in Iran, right? And in my understanding of Washington is that no president, be they Democrat or Republican, want to confront a situation where Iran becomes a capable nuclear weapons state on their watch. And therefore, what we have seen, from Washington is, on the one hand, this notion of, yes, we want to make things such as, filtering stuff and providing internet access to the public, more sanctioning of human rights violation. But this is happening parallel to those negotiations that are taking place in regard to the nuclear issue. Again, just a couple of days ago, we heard of Robert Malley, meeting with Iran's representatives to the UN, apparently in terms of this discussion. My sense is that we, as the Iranian American community, need to realize and have a realistic assessment of how Washington works, how the priorities of international politics are really playing themselves out. We keep talking the language of what ought to be, and not necessarily the language of what is and happening. And the gulf between what is and what ought to be, sometimes is not quite, realistic. So my suggestion would be, again, as we rethink, right, the maturation process of the opposition movement and prepare for the next round of protests that might happen, is to really be a bit more crystal clear in terms of what it is that we are asking Washington or European capitals exactly to do, that happens to be, realistic with an eye toward the type of concerns on the nuclear front that exist, after all.
I think that is a very good segue to the next question that says, I'm interested to learn more about regime change and how it's used. Are Iranian Americans in favor of the United States government actively seeking to oust the regime? Are the respondents in favor of US military action? Please explain the extent and limit of, quote, these are in quotes, regime change framing. This is especially important given the low support for some groups like MEK, which explicitly advocates for this.
I'm not going to entirely unpack that because I don't have the data, but I think the one thing we can say is that, this is the first time we've seen the diaspora mirror what the people in Iran want, and that they want this regime gone. And that's why you've seen so much activism on our community's front. Yes, they've always had solidarity protests in 99, 2009, 2018, but to see us come out in full force, not just in the US, but in Canada, in Europe, that's new. And there's really been this commonality where I think before there was a sense of rapprochement, the JCPOA, and I think that overwhelmingly the majority, and again, I guess we should look at your polling too to accurately reflect this. I think you're really seeing that the community is overwhelmingly supporting what the people inside Iran want and are using their voices because they live in the West and have the ability to do so to amplify that. And I think that's been really new here and what we've been seeing happen.
Mehrzad or Hadi on sort of what this change encompasses?
Yeah, I mean, it's really what Holly said about supporting what people in the country want is the essential part. What we really need for US government to do is to have an active support for this protest movement, but it doesn't mean hyperactive. It doesn't mean it has to take reign of the regime change process or decide who should be the replacement, or I don't think Iranian people don't want that initiative, but they want to be recognized that the Islamic Republic is not wanted by the Iranian people. And I was just talking to the State Department last week, suggesting to them that the kind of policies that they have to have a consistent policy of promoting human rights. It cannot be a tweet and one action at the UN here and then drop the ball. Why aren't they forming common ground with like-minded countries, not just Europe and Canada, but Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, Mexico? These are countries, Chile, who are showing interest on Iran human rights at the UN level. But at the UN level, China, Russia, and many Iran supporters like Pakistan, Venezuela, Cuba, going to prevent more action, especially in New York. Why aren't they putting out more common statements and foreign policy that human rights in Iran is a major pillar of our foreign policy toward Iran across these geographies? Unfortunately, that kind of imagination, creativity, I don't see. I still see very reactive policies out of Washington on human rights in Iran. And that is where they can help the regime change process, not to get politically involved or put an American stamp on it.
And I think your statement also helps lead into the next set of questions, Hadi. We have a question which says the peace brokered by China between the Saudis and Iran were very demoralizing for Iranians. And Mr. Taheri recently stated that the move has lifted the grenade out of the Islamic Republic's hand, so that in essence, the Islamic Republic can't bomb neighboring countries, especially those on the south side of the Persian Gulf. And I think a second thought here is the IRGC is pushing Khamenei aside. What are your thoughts on the change of power inside Iran and Iran's relation with other countries like Russia? And I'm going to tack on a second question here that says specifically for Hadi in relation to, I'm no doubt Mehrzad will answer this question on IR, but in relation to that, Hadi, how does your organization pressure Arab countries in the MENA region to stop commerce and other political relations with Iran? You were talking about creativity and joint statements and not being reactive, but proactive. So I think we can kind of put these two questions together in terms of, what rather than saying things, what's the action you see and should be done?
So if I may address the first part of the question, look, I think the Islamic Republic is looking at foreign policy as a type of get out of the jail card that it can use, right, in terms of putting this crisis behind it. So whether it's the rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, or now there is talk of another rapprochement with, Egypt, I think this is part and parcel of that plan. Basically, the way I read Iran's foreign policy in the aftermath of this uprising is that they are trying to communicate to Western capitals that, look, we are still in charge, right? We are still in charge. You still need to deal with us, and things of that sort, as a way of, again, discouraging any type of support for the opposition. Surely, it has been a long-term part of Iran's foreign policy to get closer to the likes of China and Russia as a counterforce to what Washington and European capitals can put together. So we are seeing Iran getting ever more closer to them. It was admitted into the Shanghai agreement and the like. These are all part and parcel of that same game plan. Now, as was pointed out, people might see the approach with the Saudis as a bit of a disappointment, but this goes back to the point I was making a moment ago, right? These are the realities of international politics, all right? And I think we really need to be crystal clear. We have open, wide eyes about what the realities of national interest dictate for each country in terms of how they go about conducting their business in this regard. The fact of the matter is that the Saudis and the Iranians both see merits in trying to de-escalate their tensions. The Saudis are trying to get out of the problem that they have created for themselves in Yemen. Iran wants to see better relations as a way of expanding its ties and economic opportunities in the neighborhood in this regard. So these are important issues. Let me also add the following, in regard to the other question. I, for one, am not in favor of any type of U.S. military involvement in Iran. I mean, let's be frank about it. The track record has not been that great. We just need to look to our east and west to see what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, not to want to be advocating for, U.S. Boots on the ground in a place like Iran. I think the more important and effective policy regarding regime change, right, is to see how we can transform what I describe as episodic uprisings in Iran that are happening now, right, and cool down after a while, to something more permanent, to something more durable, right? Because we know the opposition exists. We know disappointment with the Islamic Republic is all over the place. So, in my view, the key to unlocking the dynamics of what's going on is to really trying to strengthen those civil society institutions in Iran and enabling, in whatever way possible, including getting support from Western governments, right, to strengthen civil society and make these episodic movements become more durable, lasting. Look, the magical formula of revolutions is known to us. It's three things: numbers, tactics, and continuity. Numbers, tactics, and continuity. And those are the three elements we need to work on.
Great. Thank you very much. And Hadi, there was that, I don't know if you want to address the first part.
I guess the
definitely
question
address the
is,
second.
are we reaching to establish as big a tent of international members of UN and governments to pressure Iran on human rights? As I mentioned, we have a long way. Even US and Europe are not coordinating, let alone the countries I mentioned in Asia and South America. For the region, yes, we do talk to all member states, even China we have talked to recently. We send letters to many countries. But the truth is that the main countries in the region, such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia, they themselves have very terrible human rights records. And it is an uphill battle to put them on the map in speaking out on Iran, or I'm not sure if we really wanted, it would sound very hypocritical coming out of their mouth. But the best would be to have an international coalition where the base of it are governments who have the legitimacy to speak about it, like Japan, like South Korea, New Zealand, Mexico, Chile, and then all of Europe and US and Canada along with it. So that's when the Iranian government really takes notice, when the protests go beyond Western Europe and North America.
Thank you. So we are past 1 o'clock, but I do want to try and get a few more questions in, if possible. One of them is about sort of, two of them are related and overlap. One says, to what extent are divisions within the protest movement in Iran mirrored within the Iranian American community? And another one says, what can you say about the current self-destructive arguments within the Iranian diaspora, where individuals and groups attack each other or throw nasty personal terms? Isn't this a sad commentary on those seeking democracy, freedom, and pluralism?
I would certainly agree with what has been said. I think, this mudsliding and character assassinations that we have seen, within the opposition, I think is quite unfortunate. So I think, we need to put that aside. I don't see anything positive coming out of this. If I were to analyze what happened, I think there was a sense of what I call false radicalism that dominated the discourse of many of people in the diasporic community, and I think that false radicalism really ended up creating this type of cleavages that we are seeing. So, for example, going after and denouncing the national soccer players, I think was truly a terrible mistake made on the part of many in the opposition. Our opposition is not with the soccer players, right? The opposition is with the regime. So I think we fell victim to some of these artificially created divisions that unfortunately were not productive in that sense. But look, it's more than an issue of my ethics or your ethics or the ethics of this leader and that leader. Again, as a political sociologist, I want to take the longer view, right? The larger view. The fact is, the Iranian opposition for a long time, over the last 4 decades, was engaging in what could be described as a dialogue of the deaf. Nobody was listening to one another. If you're a royalist, you didn't want to hear what the left has to say. If you're a leftist, you didn't want to see what the reformists have to say, et cetera, et cetera. I think this movement has demonstrated, right, that we do need to listen to one another because the opposition is a rainbow. There is no one individual that can claim to be representing the diversity of the Iranian opposition. So the sooner we come to that recognition of the rainbow nature of this opposition, I think the better we will be in terms of accomplishing the goals that everyone is after, a better future for the country.
There is another question for Hadi. In terms of self-defense, I'm not gonna, from the legal point, the question's for you. So when does self-defense cross the line and turn a movement from non-violent to violent?
Yeah, I mean, this is really referring to very deep discussions and arguments inside and outside Iran for the past 2 years. I'll make it quick. There is really not much time, but look, all means of violence are in the hands of the government and security forces. People who go to the streets don't have any weapons or any organization to carry out violence against people who are killing them, blinding them, torturing them, raping them. So obviously those people on the street, if they come under attack and can protect each other, it's a requirement really that they have to. But as long as I don't see, anyone organizing armed movement or violent activities where innocent lives are taken, random attacks, I think people on the street while under attack, if they defend themselves, it is self-defense. And I cannot put any blame on any of them, given the level of violence they're facing. But I do not see any indication of means of violence being acquired, organized, and turned against the government, which even that could be a new phase that, depending on how it's carried out, may be legitimate, given how horrible. Let's not forget that the UN expert looking at the past 9 months has called these crimes against humanity happening. So we can't expect the Iranian people to continue to be subject to this level of violence. But I'm obviously against any violent turn of these events and hoping the nonviolent nature of it will triumph.
And I would just point out the technical line, at least within the United States, is commensurate violence. So the line that Hadi and I would say is, if you are facing a gun, you can, by legal American criminal standards, pick up a gun. So just so we're clear on where that line is, and sort of at least one country's standard that has been followed around the world, self-defense is commensurate violence. So we are really, I know we have sort of congressional attendees and we are over our 1 o'clock time. Just from the questions that remain, and they're numerous, I would like to just pick out what I think is probably where we want to end, and that is how to help broadcast the voices from Iran outside of Iran. Your suggestions, what you're doing, and how others in the United States can help do that.
I'll tackle that because I just wrote about it the other week about
Yes, well, it's for you. So.
Yeah, the State Department needs to change its messaging strategy. I think the key here, and I mentioned this earlier, is yes, there's not a lot of media coverage on it anymore, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. It's still happening. And I think it's important to amplify what's happening on Iran, talk about it. If you're an Iranian on this call your members of Congress, write to them, keep talking about it, share it on social media. I can't tell you, I live here in Washington, D.C., how many people I meet that still are shocked to hear that the poisonings are still ongoing because it's not in the media. So I think amplifying what's happening in Iran is very important. And so it doesn't mean you have to have a big social media following. It means posting on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and talking about it with your friends and family. So that's just my basic advice.
And I'm going to follow Holly to say that PAAIA does have a political action hub and website where you have pre-written letters that you can copy and paste and send to your representative and member of Congress. We are very much over our time. And so I'm sorry for the questions we can't get to. We appreciate everyone joining us today on our 9-month review and where we are in terms of Iran's domestic internal situation. And hope you guys will all return to catch the next one. And please, by all means, send little virtual snaps and claps for our esteemed panelists and their help in going over and their assessments today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good one.